Yes, I do. I was born in Belarus to a Belarusian mother and a Bangladeshi father. And as such, I am a Belarusian citizen and thus a citizen of a European country. Hence, I do consider myself European, and I feel quite invested in the future of the European continent. For me, it was the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, uh, which really marked the end of an era, of course, in modern European history. I was very young, of course, when this happened. I was just 11 years old, but these were tremendous, earth shaking events. Even people as young as myself, as I was then, were able to appreciate the fact that history was being made right in front of our very eyes, often in a quite literal sense. And The fall of the socialist federations, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia, marked the end of one era, but then the formation of the EU in 1993 marked the beginning of another, of an era of great potential and promise. Of course, 93 was when the European Economic Community was renamed the European Union. And the European Union was supposed to embody the best of what the old socialist federations were supposed to have been in theory, though they often weren't in practice. The idea was to share or pool sovereignty for mutual benefit, and of course by democratic means. And this is something that I was really hopeful that Belarus would join. Of course, this hasn't happened, and that's almost entirely our own fault, given the sort of nature of the regime that we have in Belarus. I am probably in a minority in Belarus when I feel that it's a tremendous pity that Belarus has not walked down the same road as three of our neighbors, as Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, in joining the European Union. Nevertheless, support for one day joining the EU in Belarus is growing. And the latest poll from December of last year shows that almost a third, 32% of Belarusians would like to join the EU one day. And the current system of governance in Belarus is not eternal. Things are likely to change one day, and when the day comes, it is still my hope that at some point in my lifetime I will see Belarus at least moving in the direction of joining the EU. Without the shadow of a doubt, this was the Bosnian War of the early 1990s. And in particular, of course, as part of this war, the genocide of Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks, the genocide that they underwent, and in particular the infamy of the Srebrenica massacre. This was something that happened in Europe. It was something that happened on the watch of the UN and of peacekeeping forces from countries like the Netherlands. And in fact, just last year, the Dutch Supreme Court recognized that the Netherlands actually bears partial responsibility for what happened to at least a certain number of the Bosniak victims of this genocide. But from what I've read in the news, the court ruled that the Netherlands bears 10% of the responsibility. Now, how in the world one goes about quantifying one's responsibility in percentage terms for something so awful, I cannot begin to hazard a guess at. Nevertheless, it does show a kind of awakening that's happening too late, certainly in Europe, but nevertheless, some shadow of awareness of how wrong what happened was. Of course, we have echoes of that in the kind of unresolved problem of Islamophobia that exists in European societies today, of this sort of intransigent and persistent feeling, at least among small segments of European societies, that somehow the Muslim is the other and that he doesn't belong. And this failure, utter failure on the part of major portions of European societies to recognize that Muslims have been part and parcel of Europe for centuries. And one doesn't even have to look at Bosnia, as a case in point, but Bosnia certainly is a case in point. For me, this was the expansion of the European Union eastwards in 2004 to incorporate 10 new member states. Of course, since then, the expansion project has largely stalled, which I consider to be a pity. Of course, Romania and Bulgaria were incorporated in 2007 and then Croatia in 2013. But there are major countries still waiting, which the EU should really put more effort into including and incorporating. But I fear that the EU is currently moving in the opposite direction. It is the ease of travel that I have in the EU as a Canadian citizen. Now, I am a Belarusian citizen, as I said at the outset, but I also have Canadian citizenship. And as a Canadian, it's tremendously easy for me to travel in the EU. And I've been to a number of EU member states. And when you show up at the border with your Canadian passport, you sometimes don't get asked a single question. You just wave through. It's very nice. But it makes me very cognizant when this happens of the privilege of having a Western passport like a Canadian one, when compared to the experiences of my Belarusian compatriots who have to line up to apply Schengen visas and satisfy a tremendous burden of proof regarding their workplace and property ownership and their car and whatnot, and have to pay a fee just to have the privilege of entering the EU. Now, Belarus actually per capita, year after year, has the highest number of Schengen visas issued. And it also has one of the lowest rates of people violating the conditions of the visa and just remaining in the EU illegally. And thus, perhaps if the EU is serious about promoting democratization in Belarus, then one effective way of actually doing this in reality would be to lift visa restrictions on Belarusians the way that Belarus has lifted visa restrictions on EU citizens, and enable Belarusians to travel freely within the European Union, without having to resort to a Canadian passport, and be able to experience European democracy, with the exception of places like Hungary, and to be able to see the economic benefits of the EU project as well, firsthand. Why not? For me, this is serious expansion to not just include small countries sort of contiguous with the existing EU, but to also include two major countries with large populations in the tens of millions. And these are Turkey and Ukraine. They're both keen on having EU membership. Their populations are, their governments, for their governments, it's a stated priority in both cases, despite the doubts that EU officials may have regarding this. But I feel that for reasons, again, of othering the Muslim partially, the EU has found it very difficult to actually consider realizing its sort of ongoing promises of one day perhaps actually expanding to include Turkey. And also because of the sort of fear of some of the EU member states of getting involved in situations that they don't quite understand, there has been reluctance regarding Ukraine as well, as we saw in the recent Dutch referendum, where people actually voted against the association agreement with Ukraine. I think that both of these attitudes are a pity, and I think that if the EU is to live up to its ideals, it ought to include Turkey and Ukraine as much as it ought to include the Western Balkans. Ursula von der Leyen just said a few days ago that the Western Balkans belong in the EU. I believe that Turkey and Ukraine do as well.